everyone, and welcome back to the first live silent movie action with live musical accompaniment of the year for your friends here at the Golden Silent Films podcast, and by extension, possibly even your first live action of the year too. And we couldn't be more excited to share this one with you. And that cine-concert we are going to discuss centers around the 1924 Austrian film, The City Without Jews. Before we get into the actual event itself, let's talk about the multitude of Golden Silent Films podcast social media outlets. As usual, head on over to Golden Silence Cast on Instagram for all the up-to-date info on this little podcast. And for all you folks on X or Twitter, just follow at Golden Silence 1 or just search Golden Silence Cast and we ought to pop up. Our newest social media hangout spot is Bluesky, where you can find us at Golden Silence Cast. It is still a relatively new endeavor for us, and we look forward to seeing you all there. We are still having so much fun there and interacting with some amazing people on Bluesky and want you to join us. Now, all those screen names and sites will be in the episode description in case you are interested in checking us out. We would love to have you rolling along with us. At these social spaces, you'll get behind-the-scenes pics and info, upcoming episode reveals, and other fun film-related materials. And always cool photos of our official show podcasts, Soda and Gizmo. Also, if you're listening to this program on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or Amazon Music, please leave comments, reviews, ratings, or both. Our show has been around for 5 years, and we have collected a mere 16 reviews on iTunes. We would love to see those numbers keep growing, and you awesome silent film fans out there can make it happen. All of those ratings and reviews help so very much. Live your best review, leaving life, and help our show grow and reach fellow silent film fans. Dropping those reviews gives us more exposure in the world of podcasts and lets us know how we can improve. As always, we are grateful for the feedback and always want to bring you the best show humanly possible. And please subscribe to the Golden Silent Films podcast. While our output can be sketchy and irregular, if you are subscribed, you will never miss an episode, and the moment new content drops, it will go straight to your listening device of choice. We are starting our 5th season here, and really don't want you to miss a single second. And as for YouTube, you know the magic words: like, comment, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. Now, in an effort for full transparency, I am not Jewish. In fact, the most experience I've had with Judaism was a couple weeks of summer camp fun at Camp Shalom as a child growing up in California. But there lies the magic of cinema, right? With a movie, you can transport yourself to other worlds. You can live other lives as that silver screen flickers in front of you. Film, really, in its best and most powerful form, is a viewmaster into what others feel and experience. And at a bare minimum, it's an educational entry point into topics that you would not normally be knowledgeable about. Now, that experience of seeing things through the eyes of others is exactly why this screening was a can't-miss event from the first moment it came across my social media feeds. And seeing where and when it was taking place only added to the emotional heft of the endeavor. The event was a screening of The City Without Jews, with live original music composed and performed by world-renowned klezmer violinist Alicia Svigals and noted silent film pianist Donald Sosin. Spoiler alert, we will be hearing from Alicia as this episode goes on. She is but the first in a cavalcade of commentators that will be contributing some great insights into this episode. In fact, this episode may contain a record number of guests for a single episode of the Golden Silent Films podcast. Now, also throughout the episode, speaking of those guests, you will also be hearing from Randall Holla, the Klaus W. Jonas Professor of German Film and Cultural Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, where he has directed the Film and Media Studies program and is currently the Director for the European Studies Center and Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence. In addition to those great guests, you'll get some great insights into the event from Emily Loeb, the Director of Programs and Education at the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. Like I said, this is a fantastic lineup that will really give you a deeper appreciation of The City Without Jews and its importance in a historical context. Now, this great screening took place on Monday, January 27, 2025, at the Rodef Shalom congregation in the Oakland neighborhood of Pittsburgh. It was presented by the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh and the University of Pittsburgh's Jewish Studies program, and the overall event was held in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Now, all of that together makes for an emotional event, but here in Pittsburgh, it takes on a special meaning after the events of October 27, 2018. Pittsburgh has a large and vibrant Jewish community, and much of it centers around the neighborhood of Squirrel Hill. This super cool neighborhood is roughly 5 miles east of downtown Pittsburgh. It is one of the largest predominantly Jewish neighborhoods in the United States and has historically been the center of Pittsburgh's Jewish community. In fact, about 26% of the city's Jewish population lives in this area. At 10 a.m. on the morning of October 27th, a violent and incredibly deadly anti-Semitic attack was carried out by a gunman at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill. The congregation was attacked during Shabbat morning services. The perpetrator killed 11 people and wounded 6, including several Holocaust survivors. This is the deadliest attack on a local Jewish community in American history, and I still remember watching the breaking news on the television as it was going down just minutes from the podcast headquarters. It was horrifying. The violence and loss of life was shocking and deeply heartbreaking, with shockwaves that remain to this day. That is all to say that the Pittsburgh Jewish community bears the wounds of anti-Semitism. It's sad to say, but many anti-Semites not only seek a city without Jews, but a world without Jews, which is dreadful. And so, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, this 1925 film telling the tale of a city without Jews is still as important and emotionally impactful today as it was as the day it was released. So, that intro to this episode is pretty heavy, but still important to a better understanding of the film and the event as a whole. But let's lighten things up a bit and chat about the actual event itself. How about we start with the musicians providing the film's score? According to the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh's website, we read, Alicia Svigals and Donald Sosin have been bringing audiences to their feet throughout the U.S. and Europe with their unique and stirring violin and piano scores for Jewish-themed silent films. Sosin is a renowned silent film pianist and composer, and Svigals is the world's leading klezmer violinist and a founder of the Grammy-winning Klezmatics. So that term klezmer, it was a new one for me. I know the violinist part, but the klezmer part was throwing me for a bit of a loop. So I went straight to the source and asked Alicia Svigals to talk about the term and her history with it, because I am sure I'm not the only one who could use a quick musical lesson. Svigals explained to me, klezmer is the traditional instrumental music of Yiddish-speaking Jews and their descendants around the world, people who originally lived in Eastern Europe, Poland, Russia, Romania, etc. I grew up with Yiddish-speaking grandparents and went to a Yiddish-language after-school program, and my family listened to Yiddish radio at home, so I heard the vocal genres adjacent to klezmer. Folk songs, Yiddish theater songs, cantorial music. As a teenager, I met the great revival clarinetist Andy Statman and heard him play, and from there I was hooked. It's really cool to see how she got involved with the klezmer violin world, right? You never really know when or where inspiration is gonna strike. And that is a great segue into my next question for Alicia. Every guest I have on the show gets the same introductory question. How did you first enter into the world of silent film? It's a great question because it always elicits wonderful yet wildly different answers. Everyone has a distinct entry point, whether it's a particular actor or actress, a film, or even a process. Everyone has a different story. And Alicia Svigals is no different. She tells me, in 2016, I was approached by the Washington, D.C. Jewish Music and Film Festival about composing and performing a score to the 1918 film The Yellow Ticket, which starred Poland Negri, she told me. I hadn't seen many silents before that and had never played to one, but when I viewed the screener they sent, I was enthralled, both by the surprising story, a young Polish-Jewish woman who leads a double life in a brothel in St. Petersburg in order to go to medical school there, and the feeling of time travel. I was peering into my great-grandmother's world. Composing a klezmer-centered score was natural for the film, and when I performed it at the Pordenone in 2017 with pianist Marilyn Lerner, Donald Sosin, a prolific and top-notch silent film composer, was in the audience. He invited me to join his upcoming silent film project, and since then we have scored, recorded, and performed 3 Jewish-themed silent films together, and we're currently working on a 4th. While we're on the topic of the event, let's turn our attention to the venue, the Rodef Shalom congregation and synagogue. First, I should mention that this was the first time I have ever stepped foot in a synagogue, and I can tell you, it was an amazing first experience. Just looking at the architecture from the parking lot, it was a lot to take in visually. Rodef Shalom is truly a one-of-a-kind building. Maybe before we get into the greater grandeur of the place, let's look back at the history of a Pittsburgh institution, one of the oldest Jewish congregations in western Pennsylvania. In fact, the roots of Rodef Shalom run back nearly 170 years. According to the Rodef Shalom website, the founders of Rodef Shalom congregation were among the first Jews to become permanent residents of Pittsburgh. In the 1840s, Pittsburgh was both a starting point for journeys to the western frontier and a growing industrial center for the East. Our young founders came here to start businesses, families, and a new Jewish community. They established a cemetery and burial society in 1847 and participated in early attempts to build a congregation in a community fractured by differences of ethnicity and religious practice. The website continues, on November 9, 1856, the charter of Rodef Shalom formally established both a religious congregation and a day school with instruction in Judaism and general branches of knowledge. From those early times, the members of Rodef Shalom have been active in educational, philanthropic, and service work in the Jewish community and the wider Pittsburgh community. It was all the way back in 1862 that the Rodef Shalom folks built their house of worship in downtown Pittsburgh, which was the first synagogue in western Pennsylvania. The congregation would join the Reform movement in the 1860s, all leading to Rodef Shalom becoming one of the largest and most active Reform congregations in the United States. As the 1800s came to a close, the congregation was growing by leaps and bounds, and a bigger building was going to be required. The congregation would move from their downtown location to a spot in the growing cultural center of Oakland and the eastern neighborhoods of Shadyside and Squirrel Hill. This location offered way more chances for growth for the community. So, when you're moving into new digs, you're going to want to do it right. Get some crazy good architectural action, right? In this case, that top-notch building design idea and aesthetic came from Henry Hornbostel. Hornbostel, earlier tasked by Andrew Carnegie to design what is now Carnegie Mellon University, was the winner of a design competition. It has a double dome, 90 feet in diameter, constructed without structural steel, instead using the Catalan vault, a Spanish vernacular style brought to the U.S. by Rafael Gustavino. For the exterior, Hornbostel chose local yellow brick, augmented with colored terracotta flourishes. The design incorporated 4 representational stained glass windows by William Willett, saved from the 1901 building, along with a large stained glass skylight in the dome and a lunette over the Fifth Avenue entrance. They installed a 1907 Kimball organ, the largest of its kind still in use. It seats more than 900 on the first floor and 300 in the gallery. The building was finished in time for High Holy Day services in 1907 at a cost of $250,000. Over the years, the building, like its congregation, has grown. 2 large modern additions to the rear, a religious education wing to the west built in 1938, and a large social hall wing to the north and east added in 1956. A smaller 2-story porte cochere that projects to the north from the center of the rear facade was built between 2000 and 2003. Quite a few famous faces and Pittsburgh legends have walked through those gorgeous doors. Notable members include Edgar J. Kaufman, businessman and philanthropist who owned Kaufman's department store and commissioned Falling Water and the Kaufman Desert House. Another incredibly important member was virologist and researcher Jonas Salk, who, notedly, developed one of the first successful polio vaccines. Couple Pittsburgh legends, if you will. The Rodef Shalom Temple was added to the National Register of Historic Places on November 5, 1979, and designated a Pittsburgh Historic Landmark in 1971. Now that sets the scene for this fantastic event. No great film screening comes together out of thin air. A lot of work and creativity go into putting on a show of this type, of this magnitude, and Emily Loeb was kind enough to talk about that exact topic. Loeb explained to me, Rachel Cranston, who is the director of the Jewish Studies Department at the University of Pittsburgh and is on the Holocaust Center's advisory board, brought this program to our attention. We have been talking about collaborating on programming together, and this was a great opportunity. We knew that it was going to be a special program, and after the event, I can honestly say that it went exactly how I hoped it would go. And that, folks, brings us to the titular film for this episode, The City Without Jews, and the novel it was based on. Like many of the films we discuss on the show here, this one also began its life as a novel. Die Stadt ohne Juden, or The City Without Jews, as we say in English, was written in 1922. The novel was a satire on the acutely topical subject of anti-Semitism. This novel was a hot property, selling 250,000 copies in its first year. But who was the man behind the book? Maximilian Hugo Bettauer was born in Baden-bei-Wein, a town near Vienna, on August 18, 1872. By the time he was writing books, he dropped the Max bit and was going by Hugo Bettauer. The future author, along with his two sisters, were born of a stockbroker and his wife. Bettauer's life was characterized by movement, always on the run. He was unable to really ever settle down until fate ultimately stepped in and permanently put him on ice. As a teen, he would run away. In 1890, he left his Jewish faith, converting to the Evangelical Lutheran Church. After half a year in the military service, Bettauer left after conflicts with superior officers. By 1896, at the age of 24, Bettauer and his mom pulled up stakes and relocated to Zurich, Switzerland. This time in Zurich saw Bettauer marry the love of his life, Olga Steiner. After the death of his mother, the two emigrated to the United States. Despite suffering some financial woes as they entered the States, he and Olga remained there until 1899, in New York City more specifically, where she would get work as an actress. Although Bettauer acquired American citizenship, he was unable to find work. So they traveled to Berlin, where their son Heinrich Gustav Helmut Bettauer was born. It was in Berlin that Bettauer started his career as a writer, starting off in journalism. He made some waves as a journalist in 1900, 1901-ish, eventually finding himself in some publication hot water. Trouble, which would lead to Bettauer taking his family to Munich, followed by Hamburg. The theme of upheaval continued in the writer's marriage as well. That first marriage to Olga ended in divorce. Single and ready to mingle in Hamburg, the 32-year-old Bettauer soon met 16-year-old Helene Mueller. In 1904, the couple eloped to America. First came love, then came marriage, then later that year came a baby carriage with Reginald Parker Bettauer. In New York, Bettauer worked as a newspaper journalist while also starting to write serial novels for newspaper publication. In 1910, he returned to Vienna and took a job with the Neue Freie Presse. With the outbreak of World War I, Bettauer sought to join the cause and armed forces. It would all be for naught, though, since he was turned down on the grounds of his aforementioned American citizenship. Now, I'm not sure how true this upcoming story is, but it made me laugh when I read it, so I had to include it. There are no other real details, but again, I chuckled and maybe you will too. I read that in 1918, after an altercation caused by a defective typewriter, he was fired from the New Free Press. Was he in an altercation with a typewriter? Was it someone else's typewriter? There is so much more I want to know, and it seems quite on brand for our friend Hugo. At the conclusion of the Great War, Bettauer worked as a correspondent for various New York papers, in addition to starting an aid and charitable organization in New York for the people of his native Vienna. Starting in 1920, Bettauer turned his various writing utensils to knocking out novels at a solid clip, releasing multiple books every year. Some of his most popular works were crime stories with a social message. Stuart Liebman, a writer for Cinist.com, takes us into some of the topics of Bettauer's written works and why they resonated with the Austrian masses. Liebman writes, a prolific author of newspaper feuilleton and serialized novels in Vienna, Bettauer championed rights for gays and women's access to abortion, unpopular causes that challenged the mores of the staid provincial citizens of Catholic Austria. He was frequently scorned for these positions, and even more so for his positive attitude toward more explicit eroticism in film and literature, as well as his endorsement of the freedom of sex workers to ply their trade. Liebman continues, for Austrians who had witnessed the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy and the reduction of a once mighty, multi-ethnic empire to a small Central European state, and who, moreover, felt unmoored by the modernizing economic and cultural forces of the post-war era, the way Bettauer cultivated controversy and threatened traditional morals exceeded existing social norms. Yet his books sold generally well. Clearly his brand of sensationalism had an audience. Now with the scene set, we have arrived at 1922's literary release of The City Without Jews. I have done research and read about the novel, but let's turn to Randall Halle, someone incredibly familiar with the source material and the film it spawned. Halle provided some great historical context in the film's pre-film introduction. He gave such great info before and after the film, I had to probe a bit further and share some of that knowledge with you fine listeners out there. Having not read the original book myself, I started by asking Halle about his experience with the titular novel and its later film iteration. Randall Halle tells me, when I was a grad student in the 1980s, so long ago, I had a preliminary exam with an extensive reading list. There was a suggested canon of authors we were to pick from, and the list was to be about 200 items long. Because of various interests and commitments, I had films and works by minority and migrant authors, as well as items that were related to gender and sexual emancipation movements. My list went up to 300 items as a result. Holla continues, and I put Bettauer on my list twice. He was doubly interesting because he wrote Stadt und Juden and Die Friedlosgasse, both of which were adapted to be very important films of the 1920s. At the time, I was also studying Yiddish. The novel is much more complicated with more direct references to the conditions and people of Vienna. It uses expressionist strategies, and in its approach to the topic, it has a particular Austro-Hungarian sensibility. This appears in the film as well. In the multi-ethnic and multi-confessional Austrian Empire, Jewish was a distinct category, both ethnic and religious, and it stood in opposition to Aryan, which designates the German Austrians. In Germany, Holla explains, Jewish Germans understood themselves as a confessional community and not distinct from Germans. Anti-Semites in both countries, of course, did perceive the Jewish population as a separate ethnicity. It may seem like an obscure difference at this point in time, but it is important to understand the politics of the film and how it seeks to combat anti-Semitism. The project could have been The City Without Hungarians, Slavs, Roma, or Serbians, given various nationalist antipathies. But of course, in the post-World War I era, anti-Semitism was virulent and a grave political force. He finishes by telling me, in 2008, a restoration came out on DVD, and at the same time, it was shown in a venue in Berlin where I saw it projected. But I don't think it was celluloid. I don't think it was at the Berlin Film Festival's retrospective, but at the German Historical Museum that had a fantastic series of films always going. I know that I was excited to see the film finally and bought a copy of the DVD to teach, which I incorporated into a German film class at the time. Now that we've spent some time with the man who brought this story to life in the pages of a novel, let's turn our attention to the man at the helm of this film adaptation, Hans Karl Breslauer. While he directed this picture, his career took a rather circuitous route before finally settling in the director's chair. Hans Karl Breslauer was born in Vienna on June 2, 1888. Instead of taking over the family business, he turned his sights to the stages after being bitten by the acting bug. His gigs would take him from the stages of his native Austria into nearby Germany. As the power and influence of cinema crossed Europe, Breslauer saw new opportunities to continue in the entertainment industry. Starting in 1910-ish, he took a run at screenwriting, and he turned out to be pretty successful at it. He primarily did this work out of his home base in Berlin. He produced about 40 film scripts for the film companies Duskis, Mester, Vitascope, Mutascope, and Biograph. The teens would see the behind-the-scenes evolution of Herr Hans Karl, and by the end of the First World War, Breslauer was in the director's chair. In 1920, not only was he directing, but he was also the vice president of the Film Directors Club of Austria. After working for other folks, he set up his own production company where he made a few pictures in the mid-20s. That again leads us to the titular Stadt ohne Juden, or The City Without Jews. And that is also where our Hans Karl cinematic adventures come to a close. You see, that would be his final film. Just because it was his final film doesn't mean he was done working or being a storyteller, or that he wouldn't become a Nazi. The 30s would see Breslauer move on to journalism and the writing of short stories. He would write journalistic pieces as well as short narratives for various publications of the day. He found a solid income and career as a writer, and would unfortunately join the Nazi Party in 1940. After the conclusion of World War II, Breslauer and his wife moved to Upper Austria, where they rented rooms in a guest house. Throughout those later years, he continued to publish mostly short fiction under his own name, as well as pseudonyms. The director/writer died impoverished in a Salzburg hospital on April 15, 1965. One of the more interesting backstory historical bits, though, to this film is the state of Vienna's film industry at the time of production. While it's not a huge hub of film itself, Vienna was certainly a part of the broader European film market. According to Randall Holla, Vienna was a possible stop on the way to larger film markets. I wrote about this in my book, The Europeanization of Cinema. Now, silent film, as you know, wasn't dependent on language, and so it was possible to move from smaller to bigger film markets. Prague and Budapest had a minimal industry, and if you went to Vienna, you were more likely to get noticed by Berlin and possibly London or even Hollywood. Annie Ondra and Olga Chekchova, Michael Curtis, William Thiel are all good examples of these kinds of moves. Now, that spot in the pecking order certainly had its drawbacks, with Halle continuing. That meant that Austrian film was a minor industry and hit harder by the inflation of the post-war era. According to Stuart Liebman, who in his article for Cineast.com writes, the Austrian film industry of the 1920s lacked the financial resources routinely available to filmmakers in Germany. Money was tight because inflation was running rampant. The value of the currency in both Austria and Germany was in radical freefall as the film was being made. And it wouldn't be until the start of the sound era and the tail end of the 20s that new life was eventually breathed into the Austrian film industry, where they, according to Halle, concentrated on operetta in the Viennese tradition with big costumes and music. Now, rolling back a paragraph or two, the motion picture industry of Austria was not in a good place at the time of filming The City Without Jews. In fact, it was really tough for a filmmaker to eke out a picture while their geographic neighbors were excelling. Now, how did those financial constraints affect this film, though? Liebman continues, Breslauer's team therefore had to shoot the film on a shoestring budget, and this caused several production delays. Ultimately, the production company, Mondial, which Breslauer worked for, even had to forego the rights to distribute the finished film because its bankruptcy seemed imminent. The financial pressures probably explain why the completed work is, at least in formal terms, rather humdrum ordinary fare. Whoa, slow down there, other Stewarts. It's a little bit early for the reviews. So, before we talk about the finished product, how about we actually talk about the film proper first? And that movie is Die Stadt ohne Juden, or The City Without Jews. The film starts us out in the legendary Republic of Utopia. We're told Utopia is in turmoil. The stock exchange is on the brink of collapse and the population is starving and blaming Jews for their misfortunes. The first visual we get is inside a synagogue during a Jewish religious service. We cut away from the beautiful service and move outside where the mobs protest seeking better living conditions. More work, more valuable monetary units. Just general unhappiness with greed spreading across the town. Fights and riots are commonplace. The people are desperate. Their money, earned with great effort, has become paper with little to no value. On the flip side, the rich get richer. These speculators and their parties are incredibly lavish, only adding insult to injury. These hoarders of wealth only provoke the populace more and more. Soon the troubles make their way to the houses of politics. The Chancellor, Dr. Schwertfeger, knows changes must be made, and the public makes it known that Jews are the heart of the trouble. Dr. S, a.k.a. the Chancellor, is played here by veteran actor Eugene Neufeld. The sentiment that the Jews are the problem extends to the taverns and the pubs. Expel the Jews, we hear from the crowds in a tavern. One of the loudest voices in that tavern belongs to Councillor Volbert. He continues, I affirm that the Jews have to be blamed for all of our miseries. The anti-Semites have a new campaign slogan. Out with the Jews, they yell. This barroom scene is where we first meet Bernat, who doesn't like Jews but does like drinking, which will come into play later. A questioning voice pops in, why exactly the Jews? That is Councillor Linder steps up to bat for the Jews, but his opinions are dismissed. You'll see when they're gone, Volbert responds. In Austria, the Christian Social Party has come to power, and the new Chancellor, Dr. S, we mentioned earlier, is a fanatical anti-Semite. He sees his people as being ruled by the Jews. People try to convince the Chancellor to go no further, but he ignores their pleas. One of his fellow politicians reminds him that Jesus once said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The situation has to end, the Chancellor explains. The people demand the expulsion of the Jews. That is the only solution. Now, to facilitate this plan, he has a law passed by the National Assembly forcing all Jews to emigrate by the end of the year. The law is enthusiastically received by the non-Jewish population, and the Jews are forced to leave the country. While the political machine is powering forward, we meet the other main players in this tale. That would be Leo Strakosch and his fiancée Lottie. Leo is a Jewish artist, while Lottie is the daughter of a member of the National Assembly, the aforementioned Councillor Linder. The three make a promise that no matter what happens, they will remain together and loyal to each other. Leo is played by Johannes Riemann, a German actor and director who would also eventually, unfortunately, become a member of the Nazi Party. His fiancée Lottie is portrayed by Anne Maletti, an actress with a short resume who would later marry Hans Karl Breslauer. With the law passed and Jews required to leave, a heartbroken Lottie breaks down. Her Leo must leave town. Now, this first bit ends with a sort of montage of life in utopia for the Jews. Many happy and pious, we see folks working and worshiping, loving and being loved, and two of the secret stars of the show, Kathy and Isidore. Unfortunately for us, we know what's in store for them. Inside a synagogue, there are Jews praying for a change in plans. Our Father, our King, prevent the cruel punishment they are planning to inflict upon us, they pray. The next scene opens with more upset crowds demanding work while the National Assembly assembles to discuss the Jewish issue. In an effort to prove he's really a good guy, the Chancellor tells the Assembly, "I am a friend of the Jews and an admirer of their brilliant qualities." Leo, who is in attendance, doesn't take this claim seriously, as well he shouldn't, as the crowd aggressively moves forward with the expulsion plans. It's the usual claims from the Chancellor. They control the banks, the Jews dominate industry, and write all the plays. They occupy too high a place in society. Their power squeezes out the average Austrian from moving up in the world. Beetles are very beautiful creatures. However, the gardener exterminates them because he prefers his roses. That's a pretty chilling statement that the Chancellor makes. This leads to, said Chancellor, officially calling for the expulsion as Lottie and Leo look on, dismayed. And it's not simple, you're Jew, you're out. It's the Jews, those baptized as Jewish, and non-Jews in mixed marriages with a Jew. The whole lot has to go, the politician claims. And Christmas Day, interestingly enough, is that cutoff date. While it's not unanimous, a majority of the crowd cheers. The newspapers run the massive headline, "The decree of expulsion approved." Crowds on the streets cheer as Jews throughout Utopia come to the realization of what has happened. They are being kicked out like dogs. Lottie is inconsolable. She'll die if Leo has to leave, she tells her father. Then we get a glimpse of all the contributions the city's Jewish population makes to the city. The repercussions of this event will be long felt as rabbis and others try to figure out how to get around the edict. The bell has been rung. Jews must leave for Zion. It is heartbreaking watching this medley of folks come to terms with this cataclysmic change. We move into one of the most powerful sections of the film, the departure. The pain the Jewish people are experiencing as they load onto trains is palpable. The expulsion has commenced and every bit of it is upsetting. This is a scene that, years after the film's release, would prove terrifyingly prophetic. Jews from all walks of life and ages forced onto these trains of despair. Families break up in front of our eyes. Svigals, who has been performing the score to City Without Jews for a while now, realizes it's a great film with a lot of cool moments, but what is one of her great favorite moments to play the music for? She told me that it was this bit right here. She said, "My favorite scenes to play for are the deportation sequences. I wrote a cantorial-style melody for those and pour all of my feelings into it." We turn our attention back to the politicians who made this a reality. One fellow tells the Chancellor, "Interestingly, our currency is still worth nothing." Despite a moment of second thought, the Chancellor pushes on with confidence that the right choice has been made. With the Christmas exodus nearly complete, we return to our leading lovers. The heartbroken couple, Leo and Lottie, say their goodbye as the train pulls out. All the while, the capital city celebrates deportation of the Jews with a huge party, fireworks and all. They went all out to make sure this was a joyous event. The Chancellor enthusiastically tells the townsfolk, "We can be satisfied. Everything that was foreign has left the country." And the crowd goes wild. Alicia Svigals wasn't the only person touched by the scenes of mass exodus. Randall Halle tells me, City Without Jews has some compelling sequences and character development. The scenes of deportation/exile are most touching to watch because they are overtaken by our knowledge of the Holocaust. The leave-taking is all the more profound. In the aftermath of all of this, we go on a brief tour of everyone involved. In London, a fancy banker plots to make a buck out of the situation. The exiled Jews try to make an ordinary life in Zion, and in Paris, we catch up with Leo, and he looks like he has an idea. We learn that business has gone bad. Without the Jews in Vienna/Utopia, the elegant life the people of Utopia once knew is over. Cultural life also takes a hit in this new reality. Theaters only run plays by Austrian writers, while any cafes sit empty or are converted into beer halls selling sausages. Despite this, the Chancellor feels everything is going great. Houses are again available, and the food is cheap. Now, there are quite a few contrasting ideas and thematic bits throughout the film. Holo was kind enough to point some of these out as we discuss the film. He tells me, on the whole, though, the film uses a hodgepodge of sets, and the satire of the narrative does not make the main figures all that sympathetic. Blackened teeth, unkempt hair, the Aryan Austrians are generally presented as not interesting by contrast to the Jewish figures. The brief sequence of the man gathering mud from his home as he goes into exile has a stronger emotional resonance than the raucous sequences of politicians determining the tragic fate of their fellow citizens. After an initial upturn, the economy declines as business has greatly diminished and has moved to other cities such as Prague and Budapest. Other countries, banks, and businesses are denying business to Utopia. It's a mess. Inflation and unemployment are now a constant of city life. As the dollar loses value again, factories are forced to close. The Chancellor finally starts to realize what has happened. As a terrible icing on an even worse cake, Lottie's father tells her to stop writing to Leo. But a foreigner has arrived in the city. He goes to a hotel where he gets a room. His name is Henry Dufresne, a painter from Paris. He's 29 years old, Catholic, and single, and may or may not enjoy walks on the beach. We, however, can see that this fellow is Leo, with a bag full of forged papers, making his clandestine return to Utopia. The next segment opens by telling us that, wink wink nudge nudge, Henry Dufresne has now rented a house with a workshop near Villa Linder. Dufresne/Leo sneaks into Lottie's house and the two embrace. He tells Lottie about his forged passport, and with his new mustache and goatee, will be unrecognizable. Their love can continue. Back at the National Assembly chambers, the Chancellor explains the current situation of the city to unruly fellow politicians. Great sacrifices await the Aryan population, he tells them. We have to compensate through new taxes. The Chancellor is losing the room. God is my witness, I have always wanted the best, he explains. Despite his good intentions, things continue to get worse. The city is falling, socially, financially. The city is on its last legs at this point. Pro-Jewish protest posters are popping up on walls throughout the city. Sentiment is turning. The tide of the populace is changing. Now, as this unrest grows, so does the relationship between Lottie and Henry, or Henri maybe, if he's French, Dufresne, to the point that Lottie's father wants to meet him. Her father has no tolerance for secret rendezvous and wants to meet this man that his daughter is in love with. We also learn Leo/Henry has been printing and posting those pro-Jewish posters around Utopia under the guise of the quote-unquote Union of Authentic Christians. Lottie discovers this during a tryst with Leo, and they are both happy with this since these posters have caused Lottie's dad to want Leo back in her life. Now, our attention returns to Lottie on her birthday. For a gift, Lottie finds out that the expulsion of the Jews will be repealed with a 2/3 majority vote. There is hope for their love and a return of Jews to Utopia. Needless to say, the Chancellor is losing steam, and public sentiment is very much against him and his decree. With some inside info, Leo learns that they would have the vote of the liberals, but still need one vote for the 2/3 majority. This brings us back to Bernard, the drinker. We are reminded of this because he is trying to make his way home in an incredibly drunken state. The clever Leo, still in the guise of Henry, helps the man in. Later, Lottie shows up at Leo's place. She is ecstatic. The woman tells Leo that her father now gives his blessing to his Jewishness and their wedding as a whole, and he would rather she marry the respectable Leo than an artist, Dufresne. Things are going poorly for the government, and that aforementioned 2/3 vote is about to go down. Lottie and Leo are at a loss for how they can swing that single important vote. There's got to be something they can do. This expulsion order must be rescinded. Now, it's the day of the vote, and Henry Dufresne offers to drive Burnett to the assembly meeting to vote. Very kind of the young French artist, right? With Burnett still sleeping, Leo puts his plan to action. First, he messes with his clock, changing the time. Then he wakes the alcoholic up, telling him he received a special wine from France. While those two are drinking, everyone is amassing at the governmental building to vote. They notice Burnett is missing. Without him, they will lose the vote. The chancellor sees the writing on the wall. After a bit of day drinking, Burnett is snookered, and with the ground rolling under him. The camera does some really cool shaking stuff, some double exposure stuff to really make you feel the drunkenness or druggedness, as this case may be, of Bernard. Bernard is now physically and visually drunk. Leo/Henry walks him out to the car, which Bernard sees multiple of, to really push that drunken point home. They get in and the driver takes off. The car eventually stops where Leo tells the driver that the sleeping pill worked and to keep driving the sleeping Bernard to Zion. The car zooms off as Leo walks to see the vote for himself. Bernard eventually comes to and starts flipping out. He starts running around like a madman trying to get his vote in. He runs into a psychiatric hospital and grabs a phone to make his call and place his vote. But at this point, it's too late. The law has fallen. This sends Bernard into a tizzy, and a psychiatric hospital is no place to go into a tizzy, and he is quickly admitted. This leads to a visually fun bit where the film dips its toes into German expressionist territory. Bernard, in his mind, is in an expressionist room with a big chair emblazoned with a huge Star of David on it. The shadows are big, the angles are all off kilter. It's a really cool look into the mind of Bernard. As he looks at his doctors, he sees more Stars of David flashing around. It's really a fun house of Jewish imagery haunting the politician. Even outside, a floating Star of David taunts him. He is literally in a hell of his own making. As he struggles against the Star of David, we see the law has officially been repealed. Leo is free to marry his beloved Lottie. Henry Dufresne is no more, and Leo Strakosch is back, baby. In the outside world, the city's currency is valuable again, and life is returning to normal as businesses flourish. The Jews are welcomed back as brothers and sisters. God created us all with the same clay, we are told. We are humans, and we have to live together, hand in hand. And that, folks, is how this tale ends. That is the end of City Without Jews. I really loved this movie. It was a fascinating and emotional watch, so much so that I watched it multiple times. Once at the screening and multiple times since on YouTube, and is probably definitely going to be a pickup for me to add to my physical collection. Now, there's a lot of small things I found interesting in this film. First, considering the heavy subject matter, I was not expecting some of the more comedic aspects of it. It's a satire, yes, so in retrospect, I should have expected a little bit of comedy, but there was a surprising amount of slapstick comedy and funny one-liners to be found. Not a lot, mind you, but enough. It was unexpected, but still very much welcome. It provided, a little levity while also making some of the more dislikable characters look a little extra foolish. It's one thing to be dramatic and dour and stoic, but you can only have so much sadness and distress, so a little comedy lightens things up perfectly. A Jewish reporter who pops up a few times in the film makes for some good laughs with some of his shenanigans. Now, the performances were performances. This film is very workmanlike. It does what it's supposed to do. It tells a solid, intriguing story without being insanely crazy good at any one particular thing. The performance of Johannes Riemann as Leo was pretty good. The best bits of his performance, I felt, came in the latter half of the film when he was sneaking around as Monsieur Dufresne and onward. I also appreciated its nods to German expressionist roots. From the font used to start the movie to the camera angles and the design of the insane asylum sequence, it was pretty cool to see that expressionism we love so much pop in, even if just for a little bit. Now, I watched this film as a lover of silent films. I noticed the camera angles, the blocking of scenes, and the various other cinematic minutiae. I don't personally have the faith and religious background many of my fellow watchers had. I can't even imagine what it was like to see this movie with family or friends who survived or died in the Holocaust. That life experience surely must make this film so much more powerful. To see something on screen hit so close to home has to be unbelievably hard. That emotion was palpable throughout the theater, and it all added up to make this an incredibly unforgettable night. Speaking of those real-life connections, one of the things that was weird and really stuck out about watching this flick was its connections to real-life events. Knowing how things would play out politically in that region kind of makes you squirm a little in your seat. You know what is to come, but seeing a film years ahead, that far ahead, making statements like this film did is really kind of mind-blowing. Those events and plot points depicted in this film turned out to be eerily prescient in the most terrible of ways. Alicia Svigals told me, "The movie is essentially a biting parody of hypocritical politicians and can be very funny at times. At the same time, it is kind of a warning. It was made in 1923 when Nazism was bubbling up, and Utopia was meant to be a stand-in for Vienna. No one knew at the time that the film's vision would come true in a far worse way. The anti-Nazi message angered the Nazis, of course, and they banned the film and murdered the author of the novel on which the movie was based. It is quite an experience to view it now, knowing what is to come." But what exactly was to come? The foreshadowing this movie did was horrifying. Only a couple decades later, the Nazis would make real the film's plot, what this film's plot only hypothesized. Aaron Cutler writes about this eerie similarities to future events when he writes, "Indeed, the friction between the fantasy that the film The City Without Jews presents and the reality of the fate of Vienna's Jewish citizens is what potentially gives the work its greatest interest today. While all of Utopia's Jews were simply deported on borrowed trains to other European countries and to Zion, to be later returned to their homes, the Nazis sent 65,000 of Vienna's Jews away to be murdered. An additional 130,000 fled and did not return. And going forward from that, its plot remains frightening in terms of our current political climate. But how important are films like The City Without Jews as a historical record? Of course, the base story is fiction, though its premise would become less so over time. It's fascinating what films like this tell us about the past. As a professor of European history and cinephile, Randall Holla talked to me about what stands out to him in City from an educational and historical perspective as opposed to a straight entertainment experience. Holla showed me some archival photos of pre-Holocaust Jewish life while explaining, "What you see is a lost world, a lost culture, a culture that was erased by the Holocaust, by brutal, stupid, violent people, and people who just remained silent in the face of cruelty to others." He continues, "These archival images, or a film like City Without Jews, doesn't replace that culture, return those people to us, but it bears witness to the vibrancy and creativity of those people then, and helps us sense what we have lost. A film is a film and needs to be interpreted and understood as a document of its times, made within a particular frame. But a historic and historical film like City offers an opportunity to delve into the context of its production. It invites us to learn more. City is not a documentary, it is a satire. It has a few location shots. The majority of the shots are on sets designed for other films. So we need to be careful about understanding what we are seeing. With all that in mind, the film does open up a window to a past. It hopefully fills us with wonder, and it hopefully helps us see our own moment differently, inviting us to be better in our present. Now that we've spent some quality time with the film itself, let's push forward and focus our next conversation on the actual event, the screening proper. Now, this was my first time inside a synagogue, as I mentioned earlier, and the first thing I was struck by was how huge the place was. It's an incredibly pretty building located in the heart of Pittsburgh's Oakland neighborhood. It was a bit of a maze, But inside that maze, there was so much cool and interesting stuff to look at and learn about, I could probably stay there for hours and still only be at the surface level. And the crowd. How awesome is it to see a sellout crowd fill an auditorium? Pretty much every seat of the two-tiered room was filled, and the age range of folks never ceases to amaze me. Both young and old were out in full force to watch this film. Now, the pairing of Svigals and Donald Sosin was on point for the duration of the screening. This was, I believe, the first duo silent accompaniment I have ever experienced. And it was perfect, really. The two played off each other masterfully while also combining to create a fuller sound that fit the movie perfectly. While I'm no aficionado or expert in klezmer tunes, Svigals' style of music really put me in a time and place. You feel, I don't know what the word is, but it felt, I guess you could say, quaint. And it couldn't have been a better fit for this movie, really. And if you missed out on a Svigals and Sosin performance, you can always snag the Flickr Alley produced Blu-ray or DVD on Amazon. The score on that version was also done by Svigals and Sosin. I have not listened to that score, but I would imagine it sticks pretty close to what we got to enjoy this evening. It also has the film restored to all its former glory with a handful of special features. And as people and silent film experts, Alicia and Donald couldn't have been more friendly and generous with their knowledge of the musical process. Speaking of knowledgeable folks, we were treated to an intro provided by the aforementioned Randall Holla, director of the University of Pittsburgh Center for International Studies, whom you've heard from already quite a bit throughout this episode. He did a great job of putting The City Without Jews in a historical and political perspective. With a film like this, it's easy to let the post-film history color too much of the narrative. By knowing the history at the time of the filming, you really get a whole different appreciation of the story being told. And the info never stopped coming. There was a pre-show intro we just mentioned, plus info about the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh and the Pitt School of Jewish Studies. All great stuff that sets the scene for the evening. It was a great way to start things off and a great way to end it. After the film, the audience was treated to a great question and answer session. The sound in the theater/auditorium of the Rodef Shalom congregation was killer. This room had great speakers that really did a great job spreading the sound. I've seen quite a few accompaniments, and this has to be sound power setup number one. It sounded amazing. I know it's a religious space, but darn if it wouldn't make a great venue for a whole host of entertainment events. This screening and musical accompaniment could have happened anywhere, really. Pittsburgh is a city full of great movie houses and venues, but Rodef Shalom brought something special to the event. It was a perfect place to show this film for a whole host of reasons. For a more in-depth explanation, let's turn back to Emily Loeb, who told me, Rodef Shalom is an absolutely beautiful building. We chose to have it there for a few reasons. Levy Hall is a nice space and large enough to accommodate the film, musicians, and our audience. There was a practicality to the choice. This was a joint program of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh and the University of Pittsburgh, and we needed it to accommodate both of our audiences, which meant it needed to have easy parking and accessibility and be walking distance from Pitt and CMU. Finally, it was meaningful to have this shown in a Jewish space. Honestly, it was the perfect location. All in, this was the single best screening event we've ever covered here on the podcast. And that's not hyperbole or overreacting. When we do stuff like this, we look at 4 different categories. There's the venue, pre- and post-show, musical accompaniment, and crowd. We talked about the venue being awesome on many different levels. Obviously, we love the music provided by Sosin and Svigals and the talks about the film, so both of those categories are a win, a thumbs up. Now, the final criteria is the crowd itself, and that was another outstanding aspect of the screening. The theater was packed with a great mix of ages. Like I said, it was a sellout, and whether that was due to piety or cinematic curiosity or both, it was a full house. And what made this crowd so great was how invested they were in the picture. As the film played out, the people were on the edge of their seats awaiting the next scene. And after the film, mostly everyone stayed for the fantastic Q&A session offered after. And there were so many great questions asked, ranging in topics from Austrian history, Judaism, film production, and the wonderful music. The crowd was so engaged that the post-show went too long and had to actually be wrapped up. And all of the key speakers and attendees stayed after that chat to answer even more questions. It was just a great environment to be a part of. So this was a superb and top-notch screening at the Rodef Shalom congregation, with the crowd fully involved and invested in the proceedings. A truly memorable event in the heart of Pittsburgh. But what of the film's real-life premiere in the heart of Austria? That big Vienna premiere event certainly was something. Unfortunately, those first few screenings left a little to be desired, both aesthetically and politically. According to Jan Christopher Horak from the UCLA Film Library Film and Television Archive, we read, "The Vienna premiere of The City Without Jews in July of 1924 was a disaster. Because the prints sent from the lab were far too dark, the film may have been a victim of sabotage, but other press reports note the film did brisk business. When the film opened at another theater in Vienna in October, Nazi sympathizers wearing swastikas threw stink bombs into the packed house. Further White Ring protests greeted the film when it premiered in Berlin in 1926, but the sophisticated Berlin film critics also complained about the film's lack of aesthetic quality. Things weren't much better across the Atlantic when the film debuted stateside in 1928. The movie would get some airplay before running afoul of New York State censorship authorities. Its final exhibition came in 1933 Amsterdam, where the film was shown commercially for the last time. This screening caused quite a stir when it was screened in an Amsterdam theater in protest against Hitler's Germany. After that, the film seemed to disappear, and it stayed disappeared more or less. But like many a silent film, fate and the universe had other plans. We turn back to Jan Christopher Horak, where he explains, "In 1991, the Eye Institute in Amsterdam discovered a nitrate print in their vaults with Dutch intertitles. That print was restored in analog by Film Archive Austria, but it turned out to be missing many crucial scenes, e.g. Jews being attacked on the street by anti-Semites, as well as the head titles and the ending. In 2015, an immaculate original nitrate print was discovered in a Paris flea market. Film Archive Austria staged a crowdsourced campaign which raised $107,000 for a new restoration that would marry the surviving elements. The image quality of this new material is excellent. This film was resilient, much like the people it depicts. And that is one thing I came away with from this screening. The spirit of the Jewish people is really indomitable in the face of all manner and turmoil." So, some vandalism and smoke bombs at a screening wouldn't be the worst thing Nazis would do in and around the premiere of this film. In fact, that German nationalist sentiment and fervor would lead to murder. So on that dour note, it is time to find out where your favorite silent stars and writers are laid to rest. This is a segment where we join our favorite writers whose works were adapted into films on the other side of the cemetery gates. The history, the art, the celebrity spectacle converge in Where Are They Now? Your guide to paying your respects to the novelists that have entertained us so much. Now, the 1924 theatrical release of The City Without Jews brought with it controversy and anger from some corners of the Nazi and German nationalist movement. This hate bubbled to the surface in a violent blast of gunfire. The spring of 1925, less than a year after the film's release, brought Hugo Bettauer into the crosshairs of groups and individuals who found his works dangerous. In an article entitled "Vienna is Different," Hilary Hope Herzog takes us through that act of violence. On March 25th, Otto Rothstock, a 20-year-old unemployed dental technician, followed Bettauer into his editorial offices and shot him point blank 5 times. Bettauer died 16 days later from his wounds. This was the first assassination in Austria organized by the Nazi Party. Though he may have acted alone in the moment, the assassin certainly had higher powers to back him up. Herzog continues, "Rothstock was defended by a Nazi lawyer. He pleaded insanity and was sent to an insane asylum and was released just a year and a half later. He was then widely celebrated in White Ring circles and their press organs. Through the murder of Bettauer, these groups were relieved of a troublesome critical voice that had appealed to a broad segment of the population." The New York Times on March 27, 1925 reported, "Bettauer, who had published a weekly here advocating advanced views on sex and other matters, was hated by the German nationalist element. Rothstock avows moral motives for his deed, but it is pretty obvious that Bettauer, who had been generally liked and respected, dies a victim of political fanatics." It's wild and sad to realize how little has changed in the 100 years since this film was released. From Bettauer being gunned down to the horrific violence of the aforementioned Tree of Life shooting, The specter of violence is never too far from people's minds. In my ticket info for the event even, they make it clear that there will be security on site for the duration of the event. Now, it's not something I really ever thought about for a concert, movie screening, or other event. But after reading that, it really clicked, and considering Pittsburgh's history with anti-Semitic violence, it is totally understandable. The fact that folks have to be anxious and security conscious in a place of worship is a pretty sad state to be in. A synagogue, or any other religious building for that matter, really should be a safe haven, and the fact that it's not really amplifies the importance of this film and event. And I wasn't the only one to feel the importance and symbolism of this screening taking place in Pittsburgh. With Alicia Svigals telling me, the massacre at Squirrel Hill is always on our minds and in our hearts, and playing for this film in Pittsburgh, all the more so. On a quasi-lighter note, it's been an episode or two or more since we've had some good cemetery talk. We've mentioned where folks are buried, sure, but it's been a while since we've dug into the actual places of burial. In the case of Hugo Bettauer, his earthly remains were cremated with his ashes resting in the Führerhalle Simmering. The mouthful of a name that is Führerhalle Simmering is a crematorium with attached urn burial ground in the Simmering district of Vienna, Austria. It is situated opposite the main gate of the Vienna Central Cemetery. It officially opened for business on December 17, 1922, and it occupies a bit of grim historical space as the first crematorium in the country of Austria. Bettauer isn't the only other big name to be eternally resting there. Now, not many of the names really stood out to my initial perusal, but your mileage may vary depending on your knowledge of Austrian history. So please, Austrian listeners, do let us know which of the names are super cool folks we need to learn more about. Among those big names are actors, actresses, scientists, politicians, Olympic gold medalists, and even a subject of a Gustav Klimt painting. All those folks are of presumably great renown. Someone to note with silent film ties is actor, singer, and comedian Max Pallenberg. He appeared in quite a few Austrian and German silent productions throughout the teens and early 20s. This Vienna-born thespian was also a contemporary and co-worker of the legendary Max Reinhardt, whom we've discussed in past episodes. Bettauer died from his wounds on March 26, 1925. His niche, I guess you could call it that, can be found at ALI-47. Tune into our various social medias and we will post some pics of the author and his final resting place if you find yourself Vienna-bound and want to pay your respects. With the episode coming to a close, we want to thank you for spending your valuable time living vicariously through us. Chalk up another win to the Silent Film Live event list, folks. This was an amazing way to experience a great film in a great venue on an emotional night with an incredible musical accompaniment. Speaking of that incredible accompaniment, a huge thank you goes out to Alicia Svigals. She was so helpful and shared some great insights with us in this episode. Svigals is an amazing talent and an amazing person. If you want to follow her work and learn more about her great music, head over to aliciasvigals.com. You can also find out more about her Facebook and Instagram pages there. And that website will be in the episode description for you all to check out. Again, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you to you, Alicia, from all of us here at the Golden Silent Films podcast. Also, while we're in the thanking process, let's send our gratitude to Randall Holla, Professor of Film and Director of the European Studies Center at Pitt. His knowledge and experiences have really contributed to the making this episode one we are super, super proud of. And another big thank you goes out to the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh and the Jewish Studies program at the University of Pittsburgh for setting up such a great event and hopefully not the last screening of some great Jewish films. Emily Loeb, Director of the Programs and Education for the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, can't be thanked enough for indulging all of my questions and curiosity. It really means the world to us that all of these great folks took time to contribute to this silent film podcast. And if you want to see more about the great events being put on by the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, look no further than hcofpgh.org. They are a great organization doing great work in the Pittsburgh community for an incredible cause. Did you enjoy this first foray into Austrian silent film? What Jewish films should we take a deeper look at? What awesome live screenings have you attended so far in 2025? Tell us your stories. Let us know all of that and more at the various social media spots of the Golden Silent Films podcast. With that segue out of the way, if you have forgotten, we are on Bluesky, Instagram, Twitter, Let us know your thoughts on this episode. What silent and silent-related movies, past or present, do you want us to look at next? Our world of silent movie knowledge and experience is constantly expanding, and we always need your input for our future episodes here and beyond. You can always find us at Golden Silence Cast on Instagram, at Golden Silence 1 on Twitter, and at Golden Silence Cast now on Bluesky. And again, if you listen to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or any other podcast outlet that allows it, subscribe, rate, review. If you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, and comment. It does a lot for our visibility, and we love hearing your thoughts and ideas. We really, really appreciate all of your incredible support, and seeing how much you folks are listening only makes us want to make bigger, better, and more epic episodes. So, with all that being said, thank you to all of you fine listeners for all of your fine listening. And don't forget, the silents are golden, and the talkies, they're just a fad. And show your support to all of the great people and organizations that helped make this episode possible. The Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh connects the horrors of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism with injustices of today. Through education, the Holocaust Center seeks to address these injustices and empower individuals to build a more civil and humane society. Offerings include exhibits in our public gallery, an extensive library and archive, engaging cultural events, internationally renowned speakers, and free and affordable resources for teachers. If you want to learn more about them or check out some of their amazing events yourself, please waste no time and head to hcofpgh.org, and a link will be in the episode notes. That is hcofpgh.org.